The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, present the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World. In this talk, A Democratic Paralysis, How the U.S. Withdrawal and the EU's Malfunctioning Bureaucracy Helped Russia Undermine Pro-Democracy Civil Society in Eastern Europe, the University of Colorado Boulder's Dr. Svetislav Darian presents his analysis. Civil society organizations were an important tool in inducing reforms in the democratic development of Eastern European countries in the years after the end of communism, their impact amplified by funding from the US and EU in the early years of the Union. But then Russia saw an opportunity in the US withdrawal from the region and the EU's dysfunction in the late 2000s, and successfully started funding CSOs, delegitimizing and corrupting the democratic process.
Derderyan is an adjunct professor of political science at both the University of Colorado Boulder and University of Denver. He grew up in Bulgaria and moved to the U.S. as a teenager for college. His research focuses broadly on anti-corruption efforts, Eastern Europe, foreign direct investment, and the role of international organizations in democratization, development, and sovereignty issues. His recent co-authored book examines the trends of the growing power of international organizations relative to their member states since the 1950s. This is his second trip to Alaska after he was here last summer with his wife. They fell in love with the picturesque scenery and the wildlife, especially orcas, humpbacks, black bears, the warm and kind people, and of course, Juneau's famous red dog. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Svetoslav Darian.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you everyone for being part of this wonderful experience. I wanna start by echoing my colleagues' remarks about the wonderful welcome that we have all received here over the last couple of days. Being part of this forum has been a true pleasure and a true privilege. I have been hosted graciously by David, and I also want to thank Rory and Rick, Carl, Britta, everyone else for all your hard work and making this possible. This is a truly rewarding experience for all of us. That said, and on a lighter note, let me start talking about the democratic paralysis in Eastern Europe, and possibly suggest that some of these concerning trends may also be in the process of expanding westward and affecting some of the older, more established democracies of Western Europe, and most definitely the United States as well. I was born in 1982 in Bulgaria, and I spent the first 7 years of my life under communism. And I remember these days with much love. These were carefree days. I enjoyed my time under communism. I ate ice cream. My parents took me to the zoo, and I enjoyed seeing the different animals from around the world. I also remember that chalk was free. You could go to any drugstore, and as a kid, you could just ask for chalk of any color, and then you can take this chalk and you could draw and paint on streets, on sidewalks, on buildings, and then when the next rain comes, it will wash everything away. But you felt like you were accomplishing something as you were drawing. So my experience in the 80s was an incredibly positive one, but it was not the experience that the generations before me, for the most part, had under communism. My parents, for example, don't remember the 80s, the 70s, the 60s as ardently as I remember the 80s. For them, communism was a different experience. It was the times when you could not listen to the Beatles because you will be deemed an agent of the capitalist West. It was the times when if you wanted to wear jeans, some of you wear jeans today, And I think it's a wonderful article of clothing. But if you wore jeans, you ran the risk of being labeled by state officials or by various hypocrites within society as a problematic person. If you went to church, you could you could face certain repercussions because of this. My grandmother was an ardent churchgoer, and she continued going to church during these communist days against the advice of good reason. And she was confronted a couple of times by people who told her, "Are you sure you want to keep going to church? Your daughter will soon be applying for college. Who knows how her application will go, given that you are going to church." So these were different days for my parents. As they've been telling me stories about communism, I also remember the time when my father went to Germany once, and he wanted to bring his kid a gift, like many parents when they go somewhere. And he thought that the best gift he could bring me, Germany back then was a short plane ride from Bulgaria as it is today. Probably a little longer, maybe planes are better and more efficient now, but 2-3 hours. So he got me a banana, but it was September, and there are no bananas and oranges in Bulgaria and in most communist countries unless it is Christmas. So these exotic fruits were a special treat that communist regimes allowed their populations to enjoy in the spirit of the holidays, which Christmas, of course, was not a big deal, but New Year's was. So my dad brought me this banana, and apparently there was a big conversation with my mom that evening that if he gives me this banana and if I take it to school the next day, the kids will see that I have a banana. And people will know that the only way a person could have a banana is if it was smuggled from the West. And what kind of emblem will be associated with me and with our family if people realize that this is the kid who has access to Western goods and services and to luxury items that we see only once a year for a few days because it's New Year's. So they didn't give me the banana. Communism was also the time when, in addition to smuggling bananas occasionally, my father, who was a doctor for a sports team, and because of that he traveled internationally, even as citizens of communist countries could not travel much. He traveled to Western countries quite a bit. He came to the US during the Cold War as well. An additional thing that he liked to smuggle into communist Bulgaria was bootlegged VHS, bootlegged movies on VHS, as it was fashionable, or it was the technology of the 80s, of American action movies. And I remember as a child that various patrons from our neighborhood will gather together in our little apartment, and they will watch these great action movies featuring Sylvester Stallone and Charles Bronson and Clint Eastwood and Bruce Willis. And there were these very lively parties that were very lively while they lasted, but then towards the end of it, everybody very quietly left the apartment. Everybody knew, I realized later on when I grew up, everybody knew that they had just committed an act of defiance against the state. They had bonded together by enjoying a product that was illegal and that spoke so loudly and so powerfully to their hearts. These movies were different from any movies that you could see under communism. These action heroes defied authority. They demonstrated the power of the indomitable human spirit. They fought against corrupt politicians. They defended the innocent and the oppressed. They promoted ideas. So maybe they were Hollywood heroes, but they were the foot soldiers of the information war. that was taking place during the Cold War, the war between capitalism and communism, a war that capitalism was winning. And by the late 80s, it was winning so much that when the events of the late 80s started unraveling, the popular support behind the ideas of capitalism and democracy was overwhelming. Communism did not stand a chance by 1989 and the early 90s. These ideas about freedom and about the belief that you can hold your destiny and you can change the world had been festering within these populations for some time. So it should not be a surprise then if I told you that as soon as the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, the amount of hope, the amount of positive energy, optimism that proliferated everywhere in Eastern Europe was overwhelming. I was a kid. I was 7 years old when this happened. I remember that my parents, our neighbors, all sorts of people, everybody grabbed whatever symbol of the West and whatever symbol of Western civilization they had been carefully hiding for years and probably worshipping in secret in their house. A can of Coke, or a flag of Germany, or a flag of America, or a pair of jeans. Everybody took to the streets displaying proudly these symbols of the triumph of the West over oppression and tyranny. So my parents' generation expected nothing but wonderful things from the 90s. And they got nothing but disappointment. This was the case in many Eastern European countries, not all. It was definitely the case in Bulgaria. It was definitely the case in Russia as well. Terence talked about these things yesterday. So the 90s were the decade of disappointment. This was the time when, however badly people had it in terms of lack of freedom of expression under communism, lack of access to various goods and groceries, in the 90s they actually lost their jobs. Many of them lost their homes. My parents lost all their savings. They had been working hard for 35 or 40 years, and they had put some money in the bank for rainy days. And because of hyperinflation, all evaporated over the course of a few weeks. So the 90s brought great pain, great disappointment. And in a country like Russia, as Terence spoke about yesterday, the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s were marked by a turn away from the belief that democracy and the free market can solve all the problems of these societies. I would argue that the same dynamic was possible in many Eastern European countries as well, what happened in Russia, if it weren't for the EU. If it weren't for the EU, who provided in the late 90s and early 2000s a lifeline for these struggling new democracies and economies that were still recovering from the shock therapy and the marketization and the privatization of the 90s that resulted into the rise of oligarchy, into massive corruption, and into dysfunctional social services. Things that nobody imagined will come when the star of freedom, democracy, and the free market starts shining in Eastern Europe too. So the EU provided a lifeline for these countries by suggesting that a path to, I was going to say to citizenship, a path to accession is possible. And actual negotiations about the implementation of the acquis could start as early as the late 90s and early 2000s. The pre-accession process, the process of these Eastern European countries preparing themselves to become full-fledged EU members, led to transformations of their democratic and economic institutions that were vastly positive for them in terms of their effects. democratization, the process of democratization accelerated in the early 2000s, and one could see very hopeful results after the disappointing decade of the 90s. But once the European Union actually accepted these countries, many scholars, many academics argued that the incentives to keep working hard and to keep improving democracy, to keep fighting against corruption, to keep the momentum, the positive momentum, are considerably lower at that moment, since the ultimate price of EU accession itself, had already been granted and was no longer a carrot that you can shake in front of these countries and say, well, here is what I have. If you do these million things that will make your economy and society better, maybe you can have this carrot. Once you gave the carrot away, you gave the carrot away. So this became a question at the time, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007. People were wondering, what will happen with these countries now? Are these democratic institutions here to stay? Are these reforms, economic reforms, going to keep the momentum and keep working to improve the quality of lives of these places? Or is backsliding possible? Was a lot of the reform movement in the early 2000s, not much, but nothing more but window dressing or lipstick service. And now that the carrot has been given away, pro-authoritarian leaders and pro-authoritarian sentiments would resurface and would take charge back. So now that 10 years or even more have passed since then, the question remains, and we're seeing some concerning trends. I will talk about some of them today, this is basically the overall context of the talk that I'm going to give. The talk that I'm going to give specifically focuses on something. Focuses on civil society, which is one aspect of social organization, one aspect of democracy. So the talk will be somewhat specific, maybe somewhat limited in its scope compared to the wonderful overarching and comprehensive talks that we heard yesterday and earlier today. But what I'm going to argue is that even focusing on this specific element of democracy, civil society, and the capacity of people such as yourselves, regular people, to organize together and to promote democratic practices, to try to serve as a check and balance on governmental power. The implications of focusing on this go beyond its scale and go beyond its geographic scope as it pertains to this presentation as well. So I'm going to try to make this argument towards the end. The map of the presentation is as follows. I will talk about the motivations for this research. This research started for me about 6 years ago when I was still working on my dissertation in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It resulted into an article, but now I'm expanding it and building upon this. I'll talk about the background and the conditions for empowerment of civil society and various NGOs during the 90s and the 2000s. And I'll explain how this background ties into the theory and hypotheses as to whether this empowerment of organizations like that, which could be so important for the democratic process, was permanent and could generate much hope going into the future, or perhaps temporary and could generate some skepticism about the democratic trajectories going forward. I will briefly share with you some findings some quantitative and qualitative findings that I found in the context of this research, and then I will bring Russia into the picture, which is a theme that that has been, that goes along with what this conference is about, and ties nicely with what many of the other speakers have talked about already. The background. Most of you or all of you know that the moment when the 10 post-communist Eastern European countries joined the European Union in 2004 and 2007 was the fifth enlargement of the EU, also known as the Big Bang enlargement, because it constituted the greatest number of countries to ever join at the same time. This accession of these Eastern European countries was not something that took place overnight. They had to work for many years very hard, making serious compromises and sacrifices in order to qualify for this membership. But the literature on the fifth enlargement has largely focused on several issues that are probably the most important in the context of the fifth enlargement. Issues of leverage, namely the leverage of the European Union, the capacity of the European Union to demand reforms from countries that are in the process of trying to become members, reforms that are pro-democratic, pro-free market, appropriate treatment of minorities within nation states, etc. So the literature has focused on leverage, or the power of the EU. Compliance, to what extent have these countries internalized these norms, accepted these demands, and transformed their domestic institutions. And of course the possibility of backsliding, to what extent did they maybe just pretend to do some of these things, and then as soon as they joined the EU, they backslid on some of them. An important overarching theme between these three themes is that scholars have established more or less a consensus that EU leverage works, and whenever it works because it establishes domestic coalitions that are willing to promote this agenda and these reforms in a constructive way. So whenever EU leverage works, it works because it's in conjunction with domestic forces. Whether these are well-meaning governments that faithfully and respectfully accept these recommendations and implement them into their national constitutions, or we have reluctant governments who are put under considerable pressure by a diverse opposition that otherwise cannot be united because some are to the left, some are to the right, some are environmentalists. People have diverse interests, but they can be united that on the issue that as long as we work together, we can take this government down, and then we can continue on the path towards EU accession. So whether the EU worked with governments directly or emboldened oppositions to work together and replace these governments with willing governments, EU leverage worked when domestic pressure was in place. An aspect of domestic pressure that is relatively understudied, although a bunch of my colleagues have written about that as well, is the role of civil society. So this is domestic pressure too, but not at the level of the government, not at the level of the state, but at the level of us all in this room. Civic organizations such as the World Affairs Forum or various NGOs that constitute people with common interests, with a passion about a particular issue, that want to play a part in either the political process in a certain way by manifesting their voices, or by spreading information, raising awareness about certain issues, etc. So the research question that I have here is focuses broadly on the evolving role or power or capacity of civil society in promoting democratic and anti-corruption reforms. What have ordinary people, when they organize together, what have they done and what are they still doing in the name of democracy in Eastern Europe? And there are three periods that I'm going to focus on. Before the EU accession, or the period of the 90s and early 2000s, the immediate aftermath of EU accession, the second half of the 2000s, and the years after the financial crisis, and now the last couple of years. And this is where I'm going to be bringing Russia into the analysis. Why study civil society? Why care about civil society? There is a wider literature on this. One of the key findings of this literature is that a strong and plural civil society guards against the excesses of the state by improving accountability. So organizations comprising of regular people, of citizens, in democratic countries, in liberal democracies, have the capacity to demand accountability from local government or state government or even the national government. Think about it this way. If a bunch of students from the university here, and I was going to use the council as an example, but let me use a bunch of students. Organized together, and they said, we live in Juneau, a fantastic town in Alaska. Our quality of life is incredible because we live among wonderful people and in one of the most picturesque places on the face of this planet. But as happy as we are, we have one concern. And our concern has to do with snow plowing. There is a lot of snow, and sometimes the roads are not plowed as early in the morning as we need them, and sometimes something is just not as efficient as we wish it would be. So we wonder whether the whole process of companies being hired for snow plowing, and I don't know how the local economy actually works. How transparent this process is, to what extent is the mayor of the city involved in these decisions, how democratic are these decisions. So in theory, you could send a letter, or the students can send a letter and can say, we are a group of concerned citizens, and we would like to attend next year's meeting when the contract negotiations about the snow plowing for the next year or the next couple of years are taking place. We want to see the different pitches. We want to see whether there are several companies competing for this offer. We want to see whether the machines are recently built or they are from the 70s and they are slow and will break down and will not plow our roads very well. So we would like to attend the meeting. We are residents of Juneau. And if the mayor says, yes, sure, and provides access to information, and you could sit there and you could look at these contracts and everything sounds good, you could be like, okay, winters are tough here. It's okay that every now and then the roads don't work. The process seems to be working well, based on my understanding of negotiations, contracts, processes, you know, whatever these people are experts on or passionate about, or read a few articles on. You know, you don't even need to be a great expert in a field to be a concerned citizen. But if the mayor says, you know, I appreciate your interest, this is such a fantastic idea, I commend citizens' initiatives, but our internal procedures here require that these meetings are always held behind closed doors. And I'm sorry, but I have to deny access, and I cannot share this information with you. This is information these are decisions at a very high level. Keep enjoying your life. You have a good life after all. This could raise some questions with the citizens about how the process really works. Is it, you know, I'm sure that this is not happening in a fantastic place like Juneau, but in less fantastic places like Eastern Europe, it's happening a lot. So usually it's the cousin of the mayor who gets the contract contract. Usually the machines are old, so that and the company makes sure that they break, so that they can demand funds from the state to buy new ones, so that the contract size expands even more, etc. So civil society can help because it can demand accountability. Civil society can also foster democratic culture, which is extremely important. The World Affairs Council does this. You, based on my understanding, you organize events, you invite speakers, you're trying to gain a more holistic and more comparative perspective on what is going on around the world, in the US and in your local economy as well. And by developing this more diverse understanding of what is going on, you are able to discuss with others, provide information, raise awareness, and possibly make more informed decisions whenever you have to make decisions in whatever capacity. So civil society is extremely important for democracy because of information, because of accountability, because of many things. This is a theoretical statement. Empirically speaking, studies in the 2000s, in the mid-2000s, have found that media and civil society, in Eastern Europe that is, have been the most effective promoters of anti-corruption policy and pro-democratic politics in the region. So not only we have theoretical reasons to trust civil society and to care about it, we also have empirical evidence about this particular region of the world in this particular time period. The important thing here is that these are studies from the mid-2000s. And I'm going to suggest that things might have changed in more recent times. Ironically, perhaps concerningly, under the guidance, leadership, and stewardship of the European Union itself. Why else should we study civil society? So while civil society is strong and has to be promoted and has a lot of capacity to induce change, it is also relatively new in Eastern Europe. Civil organizations were outlawed during communism. So the first NGOs, the first civic groups started forming in the 90s. However influential it has been, and I just told you that there is empirical evidence that they have been very influential, it is not nearly as influential as it is in the established democracies of the world, like Western Europe and the United States. Furthermore, civil society is viewed with distrust by governments and publics. Governments don't trust organizations that say, hi, can I attend your meeting and can I see whether you're giving this contract to your cousin? Governments want to give this contract to their cousin. So they're bothered when people want to do that. Publics themselves don't know whether these organizations are really, having had no democratic experience for such a long time under communism. Publics themselves don't know whether these organizations are actually there to promote some other interests as opposed to the societal interest. Are they funded by the US? Are they funded by the EU and are just trying to influence the policy process in a certain way that will not be representative for us per se, but will make the country a better team player in the context of some grander political scheme that will not improve my life, but will improve the political scheme in a certain way. So there is distrust of civil society, and perhaps most importantly, civil society in Eastern Europe started out as externally funded and started operating from the get-go in the 90s with little capacity to develop financial sustainability. There was just not enough money to fund these organizations. You could theoretically start walking down the street and say, hey, I want to raise awareness about domestic violence or about lack of democratic reforms in the government. Can I have $5 for my campaign? I'm an NGO. And while many people in the US will say, thank you, but I'm in a hurry. Or, and some people will say, yeah, I appreciate this cost, here is $5. Virtually nobody will give you $5 in Bulgaria or in many of these other countries, because $5 is a lot of money. People are struggling economically. Even a little donation is a big infraction on their purchasing power. So unless these organizations were externally funded by foreign money, they actually had little prospect to develop at all. But if they develop with foreign money, this raises questions about their motives and about their role. So basically, the bottom line is that civil society can lead to better democratic outcomes. It can lead to less corruption, but there is a big question about its legitimacy and also about its capacity to do this in a sustained manner. Maybe they could do it in the 90s when they had a little bit more money. If these donors, external donors, were to withdraw at one point, Joe will not give you $5 on the street. That's the end of the line. So it's bad with the donors because they're foreign. It's bad without them because there is no money. And civil society, while it can make a big difference, it can also make no difference at all if it doesn't exist or if it's underfunded. So during the pre-accession period, however, in these 90s and early 2000s, there were several conditions that served to empower the sector. There were a multitude of actors present. The US AID, this is the German development agency. This is the Swedish development agency. George Soros. There were a bunch of external actors who were willing and interested in contributing to the grand goal of building a civil society sector in the post-communist world. Not only that, but the EU itself encouraged these Eastern European states to incorporate NGOs and civil groups in the political process, and relied on these NGOs and civil groups to alert the EU Commission if certain implementation of EU rules was not being done in the appropriate way. Clearly, if the government is doing it, the government has is misimplementing a policy, let me put it this way. It has no incentive to say, hey, EU, I am doing this the wrong way, just letting you know. But if an NGO is working with the government, the NGO has more autonomy and more incentives, let me put it this way, to be a faithful observer of the implementation of these policies. So the EU not only encouraged these organizations rhetorically, but also provided conditional funding for organizations, in addition to the development agencies of the United States, Germany, and other countries. This was actual EU money. And EU money was distributed to NGOs based on the so-called partnership principle. The partnership principle is something that evolved in EU policy in the 1980s. And its main idea was to stimulate interaction and co-sponsorship and co-implementation of policies between the federal and state level, if you have a federal state, to develop more interaction between the different levels of government, from the local to the top. Because the EU believed that if more levels of governance are involved in a particular process, there will be more supervision, more comprehension about this implementation, better results. So they applied the same partnership principle to this suggested interaction between government actors and non-government actors. You guys work together, and I will provide you with funding. And as long as you're working together and doing a good job, some funds will be available. They also provided direct payments. But these were considerably fewer. These were direct grants to NGOs for monitoring and advocacy that did not require the partnership principle, that did not entail the partnership principle. So on this particular project, we don't even require you to work with the government. You can work by yourself. Here is some funding for the project. But as I said, considerably fewer in number. And finally, the EU encouraged the collaboration between like-minded organizations from across countries with others from other places, existing EU members, other new other countries in the process of applying for the EU. The notion here was that, you know, if people in a small and snowy town in the mountains of Bulgaria also care about snow plowing, the way probably Juneau residents care. They could be connected with a similar group who has been discussing these ideas and promoting better policy in this area from the Alps in northern Italy or Austria or Germany. Learn from their practices, discuss things on Skype or via email, maybe have a meeting somewhere, and just learn from each other about how they can influence government for better outcomes. So the EU helped a lot in this process. Helped civil society a lot, and so did the presence of other sources of funding independent of the EU. At the same time, there were conditions undermining the development of the civil society sector as well. For example, the EU, while stimulating the interaction between civil society and governments, always assigned a leading role for the state in these relationships. The EU knew, particularly the executives of these countries, the EU knew that the best type of implementation is done through executive means, not through the legislature, let's say, or through bringing too many organizations and turning the whole thing into a big talking shop. The transposition of the acquis, the implementation of EU suggested or EU required laws had to be done in an organized fashion, and you know, and this rendered the role of civil society more circumscribed than it could have been. And as I said, the biggest deal here was the over-reliance on external funding, EU or other. It detached these civil society organizations from any nascent grassroots constituencies, any nascent capacity to raise any capacity to raise funds locally. So this raised questions about their long-term capacity to take advantage of the opportunities that existed anyway. With no funding, with fewer resources, you will be less influential in the process. There were several institutional changes after the accession to the EU. The first is that before the accession, external donors, such as the USAID, which was a major player, and also other development agencies, accounted for more than 80% of the funding for NGOs in the region, for democracy-promoting NGOs in the region. But their funding cycles always followed a declining trend. While they contributed more in the early 90s, they contributed a little bit less in the late 90s, they contributed a little bit less in the early 2000s. And once these countries joined the European Union, they stopped contributing to the NGO sector whatsoever. Why did they stop? Do you have any theories? Why would they withdraw? Because now these were EU members. They were part of the club of the rich and powerful. They had access to more funding than all of these development agencies collectively will never ever possess, because the EU has big structural and cohesion funds, massive chunk of the EU budget, part of which is available for civil society organizations and civil initiatives. So once these countries joined the EU, the development agencies from the advanced democracies around the world, the US included, said, okay, mission accomplished. These countries are now good to go. My involvement is no longer needed. The EU will take care of whatever is left. And now I move on to the next area of the world where I have to promote democracy or promote US security agenda. You know, there are other countries in the world with even more struggling NGO sectors, presumably. So as these countries, as these NGOs observed with tears in their eyes the departure of funding agencies from around the world, they also knew that they will be able to apply for EU funds, and they were eager to do it. But applying for EU grants required two conditions, required these NGOs to meet one of two conditions. First, you could apply directly with the EU Commission, but only if in a consortium with civil society organizations from at least another 5 countries, and if you could independently finance at least 20% of the project costs. So you could apply for EU funding, but you had to have 20% of the cash available already in one way or another. And I told you, Joe will never give you $5. And also you had to somehow have developed a network, an international network with NGOs from Italy and Finland and etc. that will be co-applying for this project. You know, you can see the logic of the Commission. They want to encourage exchange and economies of scale and learning. But it also creates a huge burden for an NGO that was started in the hallway here and cares about snow plowing and just wants to make a difference, but it can't because it is difficult to do these things. And pathway number 2, as part of the cohesion policy, countries were eligible to for assistance by the European Regional Development Fund and the European Social Fund, which is a lot of money. You know, from the perspective of an NGO, it's a pile of gold, like the pile of gold that Uncle Scrooge used to jump into and swim in these cartoons. I don't know whether you remember them. But this required the partnership principle. This required the NGOs to pair up with the local government, the state government, or the national government, and work on these projects together. So what will happen, you think, with an NGO who says, I will be applying for EU funding for a project whose purpose is to check whether the government is doing a good job in democracy promotion, in anti-corruption reform, etc. Will you work with me for me to show that you are corrupt and that you are not doing as good job as you could be? Sign this paper, we'll work tirelessly together, then you will be embarrassed and exposed. You will lose power and life will be great. Let's go. The government will not say no. They cannot say no because this will be scandalous. This will mean admission of guilt right away. They will say, what a wonderful idea. I can't wait to work on this project. Here is 1,000 pages of red tape that you have to go through so that we can get to this project, and I'm so excited about it. I'm rolling up my sleeves. I can't wait. And then this will be the end of the story. So this brings me to 2 hypotheses about the pre-accession period and the post-accession period. In the pre-accession period, civil society was strong because it had access to funding from variable sources around the world. And the partnership principle encouraged collaboration between governments and NGOs, as these governments were willing to do everything and go above and beyond so that they can get to the carrot that the EU was dangling. However, in the post-accession period, here hypothesis 2, as funding became more difficult to obtain, the capacities of CSOs declined. Civil society became weaker. It became weaker because these countries were part of the EU and had access to more money, but were but the bureaucratic procedures that they had to go through were much, much harder. So the pile of gold grew in size, but the doors to the vault were closed with more locks than ever before. Does this make sense? Yeah. Okay. So I'm not going to spend much time on this. The analysis has two parts of it, a statistical part and a qualitative part. For the qualitative part, I had to conduct some interviews in Eastern Europe. I conducted some surveys as well. Very quickly, I don't want to waste your time with this. I will just show you that the statistical analysis shows that civil society in the before accession period indeed had a positive effect on democracy, but then it had no effect. And the way I can tell whether there is effect or no is by the number of stars. If somebody puts 2 or 3 stars next to a number, it means that the number matters. If there are no stars, it means that the number doesn't matter. I felt like putting stars here, so that's how it goes. You know, many of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Anyway, so there is some statistical proof for the notion that the sector mattered in one period and did not matter in the other. The survey results showed several interesting things. I asked various NGOs about the collective impact of their sector before accession. And an overwhelming majority agreed, 86% agreed that the NGO sector was stronger before these countries were part of the European Union. Similarly, a big percent of people agreed that their collective impact had declined after the European Union. And that's one of the main reasons people pointed out at sources of funding, that is. More NGOs said that there is less funding in the EU era than it was before. Than there was before. I'm sorry, what time am I supposed to finish this?
We finished up about 11:45. Depends how many questions you want to take.
Okay, so maybe take another.
It's up to you.
Okay.
Take more questions because I have a couple of questions.
Sure. Let me quickly then say that I'll still need another 5 minutes or so. Let me quickly share with you an experience of an NGO called the Center for Economic Development. So they felt that during the pre-accession period, they had more access to more funding or more variable funding. And due to the explicit EU requirements for governments to work with NGOs, they felt that they mattered in the process and they could exercise an independent influence, positive influence. For example, in 2003, with Soros funding, Open Society Institute. They worked on a project about the lack of transparency of public auctions in Bulgaria. This resulted into numerous publications raising awareness about the issue. Several rallies in which people were told, listen, this is what's going on with the government. We should do something about it. The EU picked on it, and the EU actually included this requirement in that year's regular report for Bulgaria. This is just a few years before Bulgaria joined the European Union. So an NGO identified an issue, raised awareness about it, created enough stir that the European Union realized about this. It did not realize about this by itself. Made it a specific condition for the country to qualify for membership, otherwise no carrot. And the country had to get its act together. These were a bunch of people like you and I, who just cared about an issue, had funding to work on this project, and published a few reports, and made a difference. Post-accession, this organization feels like it has been crippled. It has less funding and much less willingness. The government hangs up the phone when they call them. They have found the bureaucratic hurdles exhausting and demeaning, and they miss the good old pre-EU days. So what has happened with democracy in Eastern Europe in general? So since the mid-2000s, this is the post-EU period, we have some concerning trends. You can see Poland, Hungary, major deterioration here. Romania is more or less stable, but Bulgaria, downward trend. Slovakia, downward trend. Also, even in the good countries, the good performers, we have stagnation. You know, we don't have necessarily decline or backsliding, but we also don't have further improvement. See, Estonia is pretty good. Yes?
What's the EU average? Do you have any reference?
The EU average is I don't have it on this graph. It's a little better than that. So it's a little better than Estonia and Slovenia, who are the best performers, and obviously a lot better than all of these countries here. Enter Russia. So I want to bring Russia into the equation here. So we have weak civil society or weaker civil society in the post EU period. And we have a growing number and impact of Russian-sponsored channels of disinformation. Disinformation is one of the key tools that the Kremlin uses right now to wage a global war to make Russia great again. Let me put it this way. A lot of alternative media channels, a lot of Russian-sponsored alternative media in the US as well, as we are finding more and more evidence about it with Facebook and WikiLeaks situations and etc. These are websites and puppet NGOs. For example, the Russian propaganda news network Sputnik is available all over Eastern Europe. People could watch that and get brainwashed happily if they like these ideas. At the same time, there is a growing Russian investment in Eastern Europe. And with money comes power. So for example, in Bulgaria, Russian economic presence has averaged 22% of GDP. That's massive. When these people control that much of your economy, you listen to what they have to say. And if they're saying you're going to watch Sputnik, and you're going to not close down these alternative media channels that we're sponsoring and that are spreading fake news that are Putin-friendly, you will take this seriously and you will listen. Hungary just signed a contract for 12 billion euros for Russia to build 2 nuclear reactors. Very opaque conditions of how this deal was negotiated. So simultaneously with that, simultaneously as the Russian channels of disinformation are growing in number and Russian investment is growing in number, in size, governments in Eastern Europe are on the offensive against NGOs that are trying to expose this. Remember, concerned citizens could get together and could demand accountability. Well, if the government wants to wage a war against you, you know, however passionate we are, we don't have much chance. You know, as concerned citizens in a room. Russia outlawed Soros-sponsored NGOs in 2015. This is just a quick overview of stuff, and I'm wrapping up. Hungary sent financial inspectors to NGO offices, trying to bother them and harass them. The vice chairman of Fidesz, that's the governing party of Hungary, talked about all tools at its disposal to sweep out NGOs, which serve global capitalists and back political correctness over national governments. All the tools at its disposal of the Hungarian government. This is the guy, by the way. I think that he looks the way he sounds. You know, but you know, maybe he's a very nice person, I'm not sure. Hungary also targeted NGOs receiving Norway grants in 2017. These are social assistance grants. Poland, the deputy prime minister talked about state funding for NGOs. So that's the most ridiculous thing that's imaginable, that non-governmental organizations will be funded by the government. So they will do as they are told. Government critics have been called people who have treason in their genes in Poland. In Slovakia, there is a proposal that NGOs receiving foreign money, which basically almost all the NGOs, will have to register with the government and provide the government with access to their accounts and to their everything. In Bulgaria, organizations like the CED, remember I just told you about it 10 minutes ago, or the Coalition for Regional Development, have felt that the government undermines their attempts to get any funding. So in conclusion, during the pre-accession period, there were donors, and the EU was taken seriously by Eastern European countries. There was a positive reform path. Post-accession, the partnership principle undermined the capacity of civil society to be as influential as before. And this combined with the fewer alternative sources of funding, because they had declared mission accomplished and left, paralyzed the sector as a whole. Russia saw an opportunity in all this. So why should we care about that? Maybe I will leave this for the Q&A aspect of the talk. So we still have 10 minutes?
Oh, absolutely.
Or so. Great. So maybe I'll take questions now, and I will also ask you the question of why should we care?
You want to take questions first from your host? I've been driving you around in my truck.
Of course, yeah, of course. Carl calls the shots here, but yeah.
I'll just talk without. Would you mind using it for the recording? It's already on. She'll just talk right into it.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And he's a pretty good guest. I've been driving around the truck. I listened to him a lot. My question is, when you are funding from Soros, who is considered a communist bastard by Fox News, and then you have USAID, the US goes there and they fund NGOs, right under the soft belly of US, do you really expect that would be considered a goodwill gesture by Russia? That's number one. Number two is...
I'm not sure if I understand it, so...
Why, I mean, Russia considered that poking him in his eyes when you go there with NGOs.
Okay.
And try to take away more of the old Soviet Union territories into EU.
Okay. Well, maybe it is poking in the eyes,
yeah.
But...
my next question is...
in the name of democracy.
Is that a good idea, that funding from external sources and not letting the indigenous power or the organization develop organically?
So,
how would you answer that one?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would agree that the organic evolution of an NGO sector would be the preferred path. But the specific context that I was trying to describe in this presentation about Eastern Europe in the post-Cold War period made the odds for an organic development of the NGO sector very low. As I said, in the 90s in particular, people literally didn't have enough money to put bread on the table, let alone sponsor NGOs that have whatever agenda. I think that in this particular context, the involvement of external actors with what I would qualify as benevolent motives was necessary, and I would argue a positive development until recently. When the sector was weakened. Not sure whether this addresses your question.
Then the counter reaction is what you just pointed out by Putin making investment in different, like 20% you just pointed out in a particular country. And what's wrong with that? I'm not trying to take side of Russia or any other country. I'm thinking tit for tat, every action has a reaction. And if you go there and fund it, they have a similar right. We can call them, it is a positive development, and they will say, okay, what we are doing is also a positive development too. So I don't understand why should I be, if I become a neutral person, would be sympathetic to your argument.
I understand what you're saying. So the quick answer that I can give to this is, and I don't know to what extent my own perception is biased. I don't want to think that it is. But it is one thing to fund an NGO that will enable it to develop the capacity to be a check on the government and to provide more accountability and to promote democracy and citizenship rights. And it's another thing to try to fund NGOs whose job will be to talk over anyone who raises concern that certain information is biased or propaganda-like, or is actually disinformation, alternative facts, and fake news.
I see a hint of arrogance in that argument.
Okay, I apologize for it.
A hint of arrogance and hubris.
Okay.
Because of power, because of money, and that is highly questionable. Because how would you defend that? It is there. The hint of hubris is there.
Yeah.
The hint of power is there, and also feeling like democracy is the best way to go, and it is.
Well, there are many discussions on this. Yeah.
But to push it with hubris and power, and say, here we have broken down you in different pieces, Russia, we will take more of you right under your belly, and then be surprised when he attacks Ukraine or in Crimea someplace, and try to stand up. And I think that is the rise of Putin, and he's there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David.
Lunch is coming up. We'll be able to discuss further then.
So following up on that, the question I have is similar a little bit about why democracy versus civil society. In other words, did the NGOs make a big mistake on essentially focusing, you use the words civil society and democracy. They are different things. One's, in a sense, a theoretical political piece. The other thing is getting citizens to actually own their own governments and to be able to essentially make them accountable, whether they're socialist or even if they were communist at one time, even though we've never had very many communists that ended up in that position where they were, accountable. But it could be, so because it's a system of government. So that, again, is my question, because I think that has been a fallacy in the United States, and often what we've done is we've always gone for developing democratic countries, like during the Bush administration. And I'm not sure that works, because some countries it's not in the DNA in the same way as, we look at our country, we formed out of nothing. And so we didn't have that history. So our history starts as democratic and goes on. When you have a lengthy thousands of years of different kinds of government, how does that work in the DNA of the people? So anyway, it's just a partly question, partly a comment, partly a question.
So again, I have heard about these arguments about the culture and to what extent it matters about these things. I think that there is more people in my field, political science, would argue that institutions matter and could make a substantial difference that could transform a certain social culture over a period of time. And even if these people don't have a long history of democracy the way the U.S. does, the U.S. is one of the younger countries in the world, but it is the oldest democracy in the world. Some people could talk about the UK and certain reforms, but the real oldest democracy in the world is the United States. I talked about the accession process and never elaborated much on what I said was the transposition of the acquis into national constitutions. This is the 120,000 pages of EU law that you have to transpose into your national body of law in order to become a member of the UN. You have to transpose these things, and you also have to build the institutions that go along with it, and you have to demonstrate that these are functioning institutions. And a lot of these 120,000 pages have to do with democratic checks and balances. A lot of it has also to do with competition policy, trade policy, some of the main areas of the EU as an actor. But empirical data that I have seen in various studies speaks very positively about the potential transformative power of institutions. And you can take societies like this, and with the right type of incentives, the right type of political structures, hope is possible. You know, so I don't know whether this is generalizable to everywhere. I'm not an expert on other regions of the world. I think that there could be many confounding factors other than culture and institutions as well, such as natural resources, for example, other things that can get mixed up in this. But ethnic fractionalization. But in this particular region of the world, I think that democracy has a future. It's just important to stay committed to it. These are my 2 cents. Yeah.
I'm very interested in the role that Soros is playing in Eastern Europe at the moment, and if you could elaborate a bit on what he's up to now, and the impact that he's making.
My quick answer is that he's being kicked out right now and cracked down upon by many governments. Hungary is, has chiefly organized a big assault against his influence, but so is Macedonia, so is Slovakia, and my research and talking with the various NGOs that had access to Soros money in the 90s and in the 2000s indicates that a lot of this funding was used in the name of the public good. You know, I know that there are speculations that there are ulterior motives and other factors that mattered for that, but I think that from an NGO perspective, people are concerned to see Soros being displaced from the area by deliberate government efforts, because they have benefited and they feel that they have done something good. Okay. Yeah.
Kind of an answer to the item 4, why do we care? It appears to me from what you said about Russian investment in Eastern European countries, it's almost as though they're trying to reestablish the Warsaw Pact, which was lost with the fall of the old Soviet Union. And in doing so, trying to increase their influence and also provide a buffer between Russia and Western Europe and the influences of that. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think that my quick comment is that I think I agree with you. I think Terence talked about this yesterday, that Putin has seen himself ever since he came to power in 2000, has seen himself as the person who is now in charge and has the burden of history on his shoulders to correct the mistakes of the 90s, to correct the soft policies exercised by whom we consider a hero in the West, Gorbachev, and to make Russia great again. and his high approval ratings, which a lot of people think might be exaggerated, but I'm not one of these people. I think that there is genuine, massive support behind his leadership in Russia. Suggest that whether we like it or not, his sentimental message and his methods resonate well with the Russian people. I'll say one more thing before Terence gets to ask me a question. He nicely indicated that he had.
Add a little bit about Soros.
Okay, so, or make a comment about Soros. One thing that I was going to say about why we care is that this disease, if it is a disease, maybe it's a good thing, David, I don't know. This thing is affecting our democracy here at home. Alternative media channels promote views and information that undermines American trust into our own democracy. And distrust into the democratic process usually has manifests itself in two effects. First, it could encourage people who are exposed to biased information or anti-democratic propaganda about the corrupt elites and about the Clintons working with Wall Street and everything that we hear about. It could encourage these people to become seduced by the promises of strong leadership, which in the name of the national interest could every now and then overstep certain democratic checks and balances who exist for some reason but are not really important when national interest is at stake. Voters might be seduced by leaders like Orban in Hungary, who would overstep democratic boundaries, like Putin in Russia. And some people would argue maybe even Donald Trump here in the US, although institutions have tried to resist certain attempts of expanding executive authority that the president has engaged in. So it could manifest into greater support for people who value strong leadership over democratic institutions, and it could also manifest into apathy. Other people will be like, okay, I don't even know what's going on. All sorts of information channels are saying all sorts of things. I'm confused. I don't care. I am just going to become detached from the process because I'm disillusioned by it. And Plato, thousands of years ago, said that apathy to public affairs is the price you pay, the price for apathy to public affairs is that you get ruled by evil men. So both increasing illiberal sentiment within the population and lack of interest in the democratic process increases the relative weight of anti-democratic path for a particular society. And I think that this matters for everyone, from the good people of Bulgaria and Hungary to the good people of France, where Russia is not only involved in this kind of business, but is actually explicitly and openly funding the campaign of Marie Le Pen, or funded the campaign of Marie Le Pen. And to hear as well. So I think, that's what I was trying to tell you in the beginning of the presentation. This presentation looks at a small part of the world, at a small sector, a small segment of society, NGOs, but I think that the implications go all over and are deep and probably long lasting. Is there time for another question?
Yeah, let me just make one comment.
A year ago this week, I took a group of 16 of my MA students to Ukraine, and one of the most interesting things we did was to visit the town of Vinnytsia, where the Donetsk National University, Donetsk, of course, is one of the breakaway regions of Ukraine. Donetsk National University has reestablished itself in Vinnytsia in southwestern Ukraine. About 60% of the faculty and students went from the Oblast of Donetsk to Vinnytsia, and they got a whole bunch of closed jewelry factories, and George Soros basically funded changing these factories into university. They built classrooms, they built chemistry labs. He, paid for a whole series of things to enable the faculty and students there to come to Western Ukraine. He also funded a number of NGOs there that work with the internally displaced persons. About 1.5 million Russian speakers fled eastern Ukraine and are now trying to live and integrate into Ukrainian-speaking Western Ukraine. And Soros has played an instrumental role, I think, in helping them form civil society organizations, which is politically important because it demonstrates that the Ukraine conflict is not simply an ethnic conflict between ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and ethnic Ukrainians. There are a large number of people. Our students had a great time with a number of these students speak excellent English too. Had a wonderful time, interacting with these students who view the revolutionary movements in eastern Ukraine as kind of, going back to the old Soviet days, and they want to move into the future. And Soros has made that possible for a large number of people. There's a lot left to be done, obviously, but at least in that particular part of the world, he and a number of other NGOs, and the U.S. Institute of Peace also has played a key role there in assisting them as well to with the content of their academic programs and things like that, to create a real ethnic Russian identity program in Ukraine that suggests that indeed Ukrainians and Russian speakers can coexist and live together peacefully and work together, and that not all Russian speakers want to go back and join the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation, and really consider themselves to be part of Ukraine, even though they don't speak Ukrainian and historically we're much more closely associated with Russia. So I think that's, again, an important example of a CSO and international support for it in Ukraine that is really playing a very positive role in the current situation there.
Thanks.
One comment that I have a comment and sort of a question that ties on that. And I was wondering about brain drain with the youth in particular. That maybe under the Soviet time and the post-Soviet, there was a lot of cynicism in the government and any belief or true belief that you could implement change. And then you have this opening into the EU, and then once they achieve it and the borders are open, are a lot of those like-minded people just leaving their country of origin and moving away because they're frustrated and they just want a better life and to move ahead in their own way?
I actually don't know the stats on this at the top of my head. Brain drain and this mass migration from east to west indeed took place in the early years of EU accession. I don't know whether this momentum has been sustained. I don't think so. I think that if it is happening, still it's happening at a lower rate.
Or maybe with the newer country. I'm thinking of like Ukraine, where a lot of students going to Germany and other places, and maybe going back.
Sure.
Just wasn't sure if it is much of a factor.
We should Google this.
Brain drain is a huge issue. It's massive.
Okay.
Just so you know.
Okay. So we don't have to Google it.
Okay.
Is there a cause-effect relationship between openness in terms of availability of information and operation of government and the democratic institutions that arise in operationally themselves? I'm referring specifically, I think it's Lithuania had quite a substantial initiative to put in place the framework for 100% open democracy. All government information is available on the internet, all the deliberations, laws, voting is all electronic and compulsory and that sort of thing. Does openness lead towards democracy? And are there any examples, I'm thinking specifically of Lithuania, of actually putting that into practice? In other words, how well does that work if you try and put it into practice?
Yeah, no, great question. I actually don't know much about this specific case. Is it Lithuania or Estonia that is doing this? I was thinking that it might be Estonia. So Estonia is doing this. One link that is convincingly and extensively established in the poli-sci literature between openness and democracy is between freedom of the press and democracy. So to the extent that the media is free and not in the hands of a few people or in the hands of the government, worse. So openness in terms of the ability of journalists to freely criticize and expose the government leads to better democratic outcomes. The government itself taking the initiative to be very transparent in the online space, as it is the case with Estonia. I haven't read enough about this. Estonia is one of the star performers in this group of countries that are that we continue to talk about as being intrinsically connected, maybe because they joined together in 2004 and 2007, but they're actually quite diverse, and there are subgroups within them. It will probably be, it is probably inappropriate at this point to be talking about Eastern Europe as this group of 10 countries. You know, Estonia is one thing, and Slovenia as well. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, it's a different story. But you know, it's something else that we should research more about the effects of transparency of information on democracy.
Join me in a round of applause for Dr. Derderyan. Thank you very much.
That was the University of Colorado Boulder's Dr. Svetoslav Darian discussing a democratic paralysis, how the U.S. withdrawal and the EU's malfunctioning bureaucracy helped Russia undermine pro-democracy civil society in Eastern Europe. The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with 360 North, presented the 2018 World Affairs Forum, Europe, Allies and Alliances in a Turbulent World, with support from AEL&P, Kerr Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight and Associates, Sea Alaska, the Prospector Hotel, and Wastman and Associates.